and welcome to the March Men's Breakfast. We have a great speaker for you this morning. His name is Lee Thomas. He's actually a renowned historian on the Civil War and a Groveland treasure. Welcome, Lee.
I have a professor in college, a Civil War specialist, who was tickled by my name, Lee Thomas, because there was a General Lee in the Civil War and a General Thomas in the Civil War. They were both from Virginia. General Lee he sympathized with the North and fought on the side of the South. And General Thomas sympathized with the South and fought on the side of the North. So it's kind of a conflicted thing. Now, I want to begin with this story to explain where my interest comes from. When I was a little kid, I grew up in the South. When I was a little kid, one of my jobs was taking care of my great-grandmother, who had glaucoma and had gone blind. And she was born in 1860. So when I first met her, she was in her 90s. She lived to be 105. And my job was I would go over to her house in the morning after breakfast, and because she had just recently gone blind, so she had trouble getting around her house still. And so what I would do is I would go over, and she'd be in the kitchen waiting for me, and she'd put her hand on my shoulder, and I'd lead her wherever she wanted to go. Let's go to the parlor. We'd go to the parlor. Let's go back to the kitchen. And she would talk constantly, telling stories about her life, which for 100 years, there's a lot to tell. And being a little kid, I was not that interested. I thought, oh, she's talking again. And I didn't really pay much attention to it. And one day we were heading from one room to the other, and she said, and then when I was 5 years old, I met Abraham Lincoln. I said, what? Whoa, wait a minute. And I said, tell me more. And the story was, she was from Virginia, and her father fought on the side of the South in the Civil War. And when the war first got started, they had a farm out in the countryside. He was kind of a smart guy, and he realized there'd be a lot of fighting in the countryside. So he decided the safest place for his wife and child, he eventually had 9 children, she was his first, the safest place for them to be would be in Richmond. So he had his wife and his child move to Richmond, Virginia. So the war progresses, and then finally Richmond was captured by the South. And Abraham Lincoln decided that he would go check it out to see if they needed anything, to talk to the government. You need medical supplies, what do you need? And I will bring it to you. Make sure that you get it. And he went by boat from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, because there's a really good water route. And so he landed at the foot of Richmond's on like a hill. He landed at the foot of the hill and started walking up the hill towards the Capitol building. And my great-grandmother and her mother were standing by the side of the road. They had gone into town for something. And he saw her, and she was a cute little girl. My father has a picture of her as a little girl with the banana curls, blonde hair, the banana curls, and really bright blue eyes. And Abraham Lincoln liked kids a lot. So he stopped and he picked her up and he started talking to her. And he said, and he asked her name. Her name was Miranda Shipley. And he said, oh, my great aunt's last name is Shipley. Isn't that interesting? They talked a little bit longer, and he put her down and continued on his way. So I thought that was really an amazing story. After that, I listened to her stories. And she had one story where during the war, a whole bunch of people in the town went out to watch a battle. That was kind of a common thing in those days. Find a nearby hillside, bring a picnic lunch, and watch a battle. And when I asked her about that, I said, what do you remember about the battle? And she said, I just remember it was really loud. And I said, okay. Well, she was like 4 or 5, so it's understandable that's about all she remembers. But eventually, I began to, when I hit my teenage years, I began to doubt, is that true? Because by that time she had died and I didn't have a chance to go talk to her about it again. And so I kind of went through, and then when I was in college, and my focus of study in college was the American Civil War, I was reading there's a really amazing set of books about the Civil War, 30 volumes on the Civil War, and I was reading the last volume about the last month of the war, and there was one chapter about Lincoln goes to Richmond, and I'm reading the chapter, and it says, Lincoln, as he was walking up the hill, saw a little girl, and he stopped and he picked her up and talked to her, and I thought, It's true. Really, that's my great-grandmother. And she's in this book. I thought that was really an amazing thing. That kind of sparked my interest in history. And then I'd like to read to you a letter that I found when I was doing research for a different course on I was studying military history. This is a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote to a woman from Massachusetts. Her name was Mrs. Bixby. And he says, Dear Madam, I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. 5 sons she lost in the war. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming, but I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and the lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, Abraham Lincoln. Okay. So, 5 sons she lost in the war. Now, as I go through it, at any point you want to stop me and ask questions, that's feel free. Don't feel reluctant to ask questions if you have any. Now, there are different ways I can do this. Like I said, I've read a 30-volume set on the Civil War, so I mean, obviously I could spend hours and hours and hours on it. I decided, instead of giving you like a more historical point of view, just kind of give you a sense of what it was like to fight in the Civil War, which some of the things I brought are helpful with that. This is a musket that was used in the Civil War, with the bayonet attached. And the ramrod that would be used to load it. Now, they discovered early on in the Civil War that they assumed, and it was kind of true in the South but not in the North, they assumed that everybody knew how to use a musket. The guys in the city did not. And as the war progressed, most of the people who fought on the northern side in the Civil War were from the city. And so it was really difficult to get them to get good at it. A really good person with a musket could fire and reload in about 4 minutes. 4 times a minute. Could fire and reload 4 times a minute. The guys from the city, once a minute if they were lucky. And oftentimes it would happen during a battle, the guy would get so caught up in the heat of the moment that he would load his gun and then not fire it. And then he'd load it again and not fire it. And then about halfway through, 15 or 20 minutes into the battle, he couldn't fire it at all because it was so jammed with gunpowder and wadding and the balls and things like that. So what the United States, a French inventor by the name of Manet, did was he came up with cartridges about this big and would fit in the barrel. And everything was in one package. Rather than having the soldiers, what they would do is they would drop in gunpowder, then the ball, then some wadding, and then more gunpowder. And so you had to get it right. You had to get it in the right order. You had to do it fast. You had to tamp it down hard, and a lot of guys screwed that up. So the invention of what Manet came up with was you just drop the cartridge in, tamp it down to make sure it's solidly in place, and then everything went from there. So it went from being able to fire 4 times a minute to 6 to 10 times a minute, which was really efficient for shooting, but really kind of deadly for the opposite side. So afterwards, if you want to come up and look at these, you're very welcome to do that. This one is kind of this particular musket is kind of an interesting thing because the barrel is bent. I don't know if you can see.
Yeah.
What the person who owns this, he kind of asked me, how could that happen? Well, they get very hot in battle. And my theory is that when close-in combat came, the guys would often go like this and use it as a club. If the barrel was really hot and kind of soft because it was hot, and he hit somebody with it, that would bend the barrel. And so that's my theory as to how the barrel is bent like that. It's no good anymore as a weapon, except as a club. This is a cavalry saber. Not a very sharp edge, but the point of it was the weight of it, and because you were on a horse, when you came charging in, the weight and the velocity would do a lot of damage. It might cut, but mostly what it did was it broke bones. Okay, so this is a cavalry saber, and I'll leave this out for you. This is a cavalry revolver. This is one that could be loaded. This came up towards the end of the war, and you could open it and then load it up, because guns before that were, again, almost muzzle loading like these. So this is a cavalry revolver, faster to load or reload. This is, now someone asked me if I had ancestors who fought in the Civil War. I did, because most of my ancestors came from Kentucky, and Kentucky was in kind of the unfortunate position of being on both sides. So I had ancestors who fought on both sides of the Civil War. This belonged to one of the great Thomases back in the Civil War. He brought this with him to the Civil War, and it's a bullet mold for muzzle loading muskets, the same dimensions as the barrel, and whatever metal you could get. Lead was the best because it melted easy, but whatever metal you could get, you could do that. You pour it, little hole at the top, pour it in. When it solidifies, you pop it out. So this was like one of the few things. I have a hatchet that he brought with him that he used because they spent a lot of time in camp, and so I have that as well. The two things that he brought to the Civil War and back again when he went. I have here also 2 bullets, spent bullets these were found at Gettysburg. They call them Minet balls because the guy who invented the cartridge system. The soldiers call them mini balls, and you can see they're not mini, they're very large caliber. And they're made of lead, so when they hit somebody, they tended to splatter, which is why getting wounded in the Civil War was almost as bad as getting killed. In fact, oftentimes worse, because they didn't have the ability to really take care of somebody who'd been shot. When the Civil War started, in the whole United States, there were only 275 surgeons. In the whole country, 275 surgeons. So imagine a battle like Gettysburg, which was the biggest one. You have 57,000 wounded men. 57,000 wounded men. And maybe 100 surgeons. What could they do? There's not much they could do. So what they did do was they came up with in modern days they call meatball surgery, which basically is amputation. I mean, if they had time and they had the surgeons, they could have done more than amputation. But if you get shot in the arm, the best thing to do is to cut it off. Leg, cut it off. So it was a horrible thing. One of my clearest memories I have a book of photographs of that Matthew Brady took. Matthew Brady was the photographer of the Civil War. Oddly enough, he's given the credit, but he took very few of the pictures that he's given credit for. Some of his are up here. The photographs that you see up here are from Matthew Brady's studios. However, right at the beginning of the Civil War, he was involved in an accident and lost most of his vision. And so he couldn't go out and be a photographer anymore, but he had hundreds and hundreds of photographers who worked for him and took a lot of the photographs that we think of the Civil War were taken by the people who worked for him. And because it was his studio, his name got put on the photographs, and he got the credit. After the Civil War, he had spent so much money putting out the photographers, and he had portable studios in the backs of wagons and things like that to develop the film. He put so much money out that he went bankrupt. And he died very poor, and his family was trying to figure out how to get money to survive. What they did was the pictures in those days were taken on glass plates, and there were something between 30 and 40,000 glass plates. They'd taken, and they sold the glass plates to people who were building greenhouses. So the glass plates became greenhouses. And then several years later, somebody was tearing down a greenhouse, and they said, well, this glass looks funny. And they picked up and looked it up, put it up to the light, and they realized they were photographs. So we don't know how many he took, because a lot of them were lost to time, but a lot of them have been found. A lot of times you'll see photographs of this war, and they've got like a crack across. It's not the photograph that was cracked, it was the plate that was cracked when people collected it. So.
Pardon me.
Yes.
Some of your photographs are in color.
Yes.
Now, they didn't have that back then, did they?
No, the ones that are in color are paintings that were done during the Civil War. It was a very common thing for magazines. Harper's was a biggie in the Civil War. For magazines to send artists to the battlefront, and the artists would do drawings or paintings, and then they would run them in the magazines. So the paintings are from paintings that were done during the Civil War.
Now, most of this is for the North?
These pictures are northern, and these pictures are southern. So, I also have some links that I can pass it. Well, I'll leave them here. You can look at them afterwards if you want. That were taken, some of the Matthew Brady photographs. Now, part of what fascinates me about the Civil War, I mean, the tactics are interesting, the generals are interesting, but just the impact on the United States. It is the event that really changed the way our country was going. Before the Civil War, someone asked you if you went to Europe and somebody asked you where you were from, you would tell what state you were from. You wouldn't say I'm from the United States. People didn't do that. Because Abraham Lincoln used it so much in his speeches, the United States, and he emphasized that. That's why, in his opinion, that's why he fought the war. We are the United States. You can't break off. And it began to get into people's consciousness after that. So after the Civil War, it was kind of a minor change, but when you think about it, it says a lot. That before you'd say, I'm from Massachusetts, I'm from Virginia. Excuse me, the military units were named by the states. After the Civil War, we were the United States. It really kind of changed perceptions about it. Why was the war fought? Now, I grew up in the South, and when I was in school, I was taught the Civil War was fought for states' rights, because the North was trying to tell us what to do. Then when I moved to New England, I went to UMass. My professors, the Civil War professors, said, oh, no. It was fought over slavery. When you think about it, in a way, when the Southerners say it was fought over states' rights, they're not completely off, because the right that they were fighting for was the right to own slaves. So it was states' rights, the states' rights to own slaves, but it wasn't. But they would never say, even today, they would never say, "Oh, we were fighting to keep slavery." That makes you look kind of bad to say you were fighting to keep slavery. It was a devastating war physically. The 2.5 million men were killed or wounded in the Civil War. 2.5 million. 600,000 were killed in the war. 600,000 Americans were killed in the Civil War. If we took all the wars we ever fought, from the Revolutionary War, French and Indian War, Revolutionary, War of 1812, Mexican War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Persian Gulf, that's less than 600. I think it's somewhere around 400,000 and all the other wars put together. And 600,000 in the Civil War. When you realize the population of the United States at that time was 38 million, I think that 2.5 million were killed or wounded. That's 1 out of every 17 people was killed or wounded in the Civil War. That's an amazing statistic. That's why you can hear this woman losing all 5 of her sons in the war. It was not uncommon.
And what was the ratio between North and South?
You mean the casualties?
Who
The
lost the most?
Northern casualties were about twice as much as Southern casualties, because the North was on the offensive, and the army that's on the offensive tends to lose more than the army that's on the defensive. Plus, it's sad to say, as a person who's adopted the North, the generals of the North were terrible. They were really, really bad. Robert E. Lee, brilliant man, probably one of the greatest generals of all time. The fact that he had what little resources he had, was able to consistently defeat the North for 4 years, is kind of an amazing testament to his ability as a general. What's interesting is in the Civil War there were about 65 major battles. There are a whole bunch there are hundreds of other ones. About 65 major battles. Of the 65, 55 of them, at least one of the leading commanding generals was a graduate of West Point. And some of the battles, they were both graduates of West Point. So they both had the same teachers, had the same tactics, and that's why battles tend to be really bloody messes. Because what they had learned at West Point was the book they used was a book written by Napoleon. The book they used for tactics was by Napoleon. And Napoleon's was still in the way the British fought. Line up in lines, march toward your opponent, and blast away. And the one who has the biggest lines with the most firepower, because the guns aren't very accurate. And rifles were a little bit better, but most people didn't have them because they were hard to make and expensive. And most people just had muskets. So with this musket, if I were from about this far away trying to shoot you, I'd have about a 50-50 chance of hitting you. Okay? The further away you got, the greater the odds got of actually hitting somebody. So if you have 100 guys lined up, all firing in the same direction at the same time, you're going to hit something. That was the idea. But what happened was, and the thing is, in Napoleon's time, you could load and fire a musket about 2 times a minute. So what that meant was you would fire, reload, fire, and then charge with the bayonet. In the Revolutionary War, for example, most of the Americans who were killed in the Revolutionary War were killed with bayonets. Most ones who were killed in combat were killed with bayonets. That's okay. So 600,000 killed. That's just a staggering number when you think about it. I always think of Gettysburg again, where 57,000 were killed or wounded at Gettysburg. After the battle was over, Robert E. Lee took off. He knew he was outnumbered 2-1. He couldn't stay there. He fought for 3 days and had then been successful. So he took off. He left his dead and wounded behind. And the Northern Army chased him. And they left their dead and wounded behind. At the time, the population of Gettysburg was about 350. So you have the two armies gone, 57,000 dead and wounded people lying on the ground. It was a staggering thing. And that was in July that happened. So Gettysburg began to get kind of ripe very quickly with 57,000 people lying around and only 350 people to take care of them. Because no doctors stayed behind. They all took off with the army. If you see photographs of the Gettysburg Address, when Lincoln went to dedicate the cemetery, that was in November. So that was in July. He went there in November to do the dedication of the cemetery. And you see, most of the people in the crowd are wearing masks because the bodies are still lying around. August, September, October, 4 months later, the bodies are still lying around. And that's why to this day, farmers in Gettysburg oftentimes will be plowing and they'll plow up human bones. Because a lot of guys didn't get buried. Now the bullets that I have, I got these at Gettysburg. And the first time I went to Gettysburg, I was in high school, and they had, in the gift shop, they had these big barrels filled with bullets from the Battle of Gettysburg. And you could buy them by the pound. You just got to scoop. You scooped it out. Now when you go to Gettysburg, you have to buy them like this. You can't buy them by the pound. But the thing is that I asked the park ranger, and it kind of made sense when as soon as I said it, I said that makes sense. You figure you had 200,000 soldiers at Gettysburg on the two sides. 200,000 soldiers shooting at an average 4 times a minute for 3 days. There were millions and millions of bullets lying around Gettysburg. And so when they first started collecting them, they would just put them in big barrels. And so that's why they were so plentiful. had whole sections of forest where the trees were cut down by bullets. Well, oddly enough, in Gettysburg, only one civilian was killed at Gettysburg. It was a young woman sitting in her kitchen, and a stray cannonball went through the kitchen and hit her. She was the only civilian that was killed there. You figure a 3-day battle with the city in the middle of it, you'd think that the casualties would have been worse, but it was an amazing thing that only one person was killed. One civilian was killed in Gettysburg.
Did they stop at night in the middle, dark, to take care of the wounded and the dead or not?
Depends on the battle. The Battle of the Wilderness in Virginia, they stopped at night mostly because the forest was so heavy. But because they didn't go out and get the wounded, I mean, again, you got millions of bullets flying around. It started a fire, and a lot of the wounded were killed in the fire because they were just lying out there in the field. Most of the time they stopped at night just because the lines didn't work at night. It wasn't because they respected the night so much, it's just that their tactics didn't work at night, so they didn't do it. Occasionally, but very rarely did they. Yes?
I went to Gettysburg a few years back on a week trip, and the person that was explaining everything, one of the big things that the North had was high ground.
Yep.
That was one of the main things that helped to defeat the South, that the North had high ground, they could shoot down, but they couldn't shoot up.
Exactly, but part of the reason why Robert E. Lee only lost 2 battles in the whole Civil War. Antietam and Gettysburg were the only 2 battles he lost. And part of the reason is because he always picked the battle site. And he always made sure that he picked the best spot. At Gettysburg was an accident. There wasn't supposed to be a battle at Gettysburg. And where the 2 sides were, it just happened accidentally. And so Robert E. Lee didn't get to pick where he fought. And yeah, I went to officers candidate school, and when we're studying tactics, that's always the big thing: get the high ground. Partly because it gives you all kinds of advantages, but also the guys at the bottom don't aim correctly. They don't take high ground into account. So you guys at the top have a better survival rate. When you're shooting downhill, it doesn't really make much difference, but when you're shooting uphill, it makes a big difference. So yeah, high ground was that was a big factor at Gettysburg. Lee captured some hills, but they were lower than the hills the North captured. And in the Civil War, one of the big things that became a big part of the Civil War is artillery. If you've got the high ground and artillery, you've got the edge. And Antietam was the same thing. The North got the high ground right at the beginning and had artillery. Antietam the North got the best advantage by accident. Because what happened was, a couple of days before the battle, Longstreet, one of Lee's generals, had written his battle orders on a piece of paper and then wrapped his cigars in the paper. He was taking out a cigar and he dropped the paper, and a Union soldier found it, and he said, "These are the plans for the battle that's coming. We know where Lee's going to set up." And so when Lee went to set up, the North was waiting for him. And he couldn't get, how did they know? And we didn't find out until after the Civil War that something as simple as wrapping your cigars in orders probably was not a good idea for a general to do. So, did I see a hand up before? Yes.
While I was down there, they mentioned that a lot of the guns the North were using as far as cannons were made by the Krupp industry in Germany.
Yeah. When the Civil War started, we didn't have a lot of munitions factories. By the end of the Civil War, that had changed. Haverhill, for example, became the big source of the boots the soldiers wore in the Civil War. So Haverhill, I always think it's kind of interesting. You drive through Haverhill and you see the huge houses that are those are built on money from the boots that made for the Civil War. Lawrence, the uniforms. And Lawrence area making the uniforms for the Civil War. So those towns, became really big cities because of the Civil War. And then Pennsylvania really started going into the steel again for the Civil War. So when the war started, that's true. When the war started, we had very little. Our army was the whole United States Army had 5,000 men in it. Because all we needed it for was to patrol the frontier. We didn't really need an army to speak of. So we didn't really have any of that munitions, weapons. This musket was probably made in the United States, but I would bet the saber was not. So it's, the pistol was made in Connecticut,
That's right, too.
Smith and Wesson. But the rest of it, a lot of the stuff at the beginning we got from Europe. Germany and France were kind of on our side. England was on the south side, but they really never got committed to it because, for two reasons. First, because England was connected to the south because they were having a big boom in textile industry, and they really wanted the South's cotton. But history is full of coincidences, and one of the amazing coincidences of the time was just about that time, Egypt became a colony of England. And the number one product of Egypt was cotton. And so, okay, they didn't need the South anymore. And the other thing was when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation and made the war a war against slavery. And England had banned slavery in 1812. And so they couldn't support, if they had banned slavery, they couldn't support a country that was in favor of slavery. So a lot of people say, Lincoln, he didn't free very many people with the Emancipation Proclamation. Hardly anybody was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. But he did an important thing. He made it a war against slavery, which meant the Europeans wouldn't get into it, except as suppliers. Spain continued to supply the South for a while until we captured the Mississippi River, because what they would do is they would deliver supplies to Mexico, and the supplies would get to the South through Texas. But then once the North captured the Mississippi River, they couldn't get the supplies to the South anymore. Yeah?
I was on service down south, on a station, I was talking to some of the local people. They say slavery was almost ready to drop off. In other words, it was just a matter of the cost was too much until the cotton gin was invented.
Yeah.
Then slavery become profitable.
Yeah, yeah. Well, cotton and tobacco are very labor-intensive crops. And so you quote unquote needed slaves, because you needed hundreds of people to harvest tobacco and hundreds of people to harvest cotton. And obviously it was a lot less expensive. But the thing is, if you look at it as a whole, it wasn't that much less expensive. Because like in the North, we had the factories, and it cost as much, because you're paying them for factory workers as it did for slaves. Because slaves, you had to feed them, medical attention, clothes, housing. You had to do the whole thing. And in the North, all you had to do was just pay them. So they're about equal in cost. Owning a slave cost about as much as paying a guy working in a factory. The big thing was the moral issue, obviously. That was the big part of it. But Southerners still will not admit that slavery was the thing. They have a hard time. Because I grew up in the South, and I knew a lot of Southerners who hadn't gotten over the fact that they lost. They were still working that through. The Southerners still mad about it.
I got a son-in-law. Called it the War of Northern Aggression.
There you go. Yeah. Well, the thing is, I thought that's interesting. The difference between a revolution and a civil war. In the revolution, you win. In the Civil War, you lose. So the South called it a revolution. They called it a rebellion, but they lost. So we called it a civil war. The war is there are lots of things like that where the South had their perceptions of it and the North had their. So it's kind of interesting for me to grow up in the South and learn one perspective, then come north and go to school and learn a different perspective. Probably the one that was more accurate than the Southern one. But even something as simple as the names of the battles. The United States military names their battles after the nearest geographical feature. So the first battle of the Civil War was the Battle of Bull Run. Manassas. A river. The South called it the Battle of Manassas. Exactly, yeah. Antietam, that's the name of the river that runs through that. The South called it Sharpsburg. So it's interesting for me to grow up in the South, learn this, and then go to school in the North and say, I never heard of the Battle of Antietam. I said, how can you not? The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. 26,000 people were killed on one day at the Battle of Antietam. That just staggers the imagination. D-Day, which was a horrible thing, we lost about 3,000 men on D-Day in one day. Antietam, 26,000 in one day. It staggers the imagination. So when I said to my professor, Antietam, he said, you gotta be kidding. And he said, where'd you grow up? And I said, Kentucky. Say, oh, Sharpsburg. Oh, I know Sharpsburg. So there's that kind of conflict that goes back and forth. Battle of Shiloh. It's named after a creek, but the South calls it the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing. Now Shiloh, my wife always teases me about this part. Shiloh was the first time that Northern troops heard the rebel yell. Okay, and you probably heard of it before. And my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother's husband, used to do it every once in a while. He was out in the fields and he wanted a drink of water or something. He would do the rebel yell. So I learned it very early. So I'm going to give you an example. Now you have to imagine, you've got 20,000 Southern soldiers coming at you, okay? And you're scared to death. And at first, all you hear, there's a very strong disconnect between the sound of bullets hitting things and the gun going off, because the bullet travels faster than the speed of sound. So what happened, and one of the people described it like this: when a person gets hit by a bullet, it sounds like this. That's what it sounds like. So you hear, and then you hear bang. You hear bang. So it's kind of an eerie thing to have this little slapping noise and people dropping, and off in the distance you hear bangs. But then you got 20,000 Southern soldiers coming at you, and they do the rebel yell all at the same time. So I'm going to do it. Now this is just me, one guy. Now imagine with 20,000 people doing this. Okay, it goes like this. I have to prepare myself. I'll show you. Now, that's just me. Imagine 20,000 guys doing that. I'd crap my pants. And more than one Northern soldier did, I'm sure. Especially the first time. And as the war progressed, they began to get kind of used to it. Oh, there it goes again. But it's still a very creepy thing to have 20,000 guys coming at you and doing that. It was a very scary thing. It's an adrenaline thing. I can feel my heart pumping just doing it. But it was an adrenaline thing, but also it was an intimidation kind of a thing for the Northern forces. Eventually, what happened was this North just wore the South down. And a good example of it is the last 9 months of the war when Grant took over in the East and fought. It was Grant versus Lee for about 9 months. Grant had went into most of the battles he went into with Lee. He had 100,000 men. When they first started fighting, Lee had 40,000. So Grant would go against Lee, 100,000 against 40,000. Lee would beat the crap out of him and lose 2,000 or 3,000 men, and Grant would lose 6,000 men. Grant would replace the 6,000. Lee didn't have the men to replace. Now he was down to 42,000. Grant still had 100,000, or Lee was down to 38,000. Grant was still had 100,000. Another battle, Lee would win again. Grant would lose 6,000. Lee would lose 2,000. Grant would replace the 6,000. Lee couldn't. So you can see what's happening here. We had a war of attrition. And Grant knew exactly that's the way it had to be. Part of the problem before Grant was that the generals were too afraid of attrition. They were afraid of what it would look like back home. Grant got the nickname the Butcher during the Civil War because one of the things he did, most of the hospitals for soldiers were in Washington, D.C. And he created this wagon train. There was a constant loop between where he was fighting and Washington, D.C. They'd go down to where he was with empty wagons, load the wagons up with wounded, come back to Washington, D.C., unload them, and just go in a continuous loop. Every day, 24/7, a loop of wagons going back and forth. And people were horrified, but Grant knew what nobody else wanted to admit, that the only way you're going to beat the South is just beat on them and beat on them and beat on them until it's over. And that's the way the North eventually won. More men, more weapons, food, everything. Tactics, no. The North was terrible at tactics. You study the Civil War, you look at the Northern generals, and it's kind of sad. None of them very good at what they did. Famous in all kinds of ways. McClellan, called the Mighty Mac, because he was a little tiny guy. He thought he was the new Napoleon. Terrible general. There was a general named Pope, who was a bishop. I thought was kind of an interesting twist. That Bishop Pope was a very religious guy, terrible general.
Burnside.
Burnside. famous for this, because it was a war where most men grew whiskers. Burnside grew whiskers. He came out like to the side of his head. He made him look like a wombat or something. And that's where we get the word sideburns from. My particular favorite is Joe Hooker, who came from Massachusetts. Hookers have been in Massachusetts for hundreds of years, not the profession, the people. Hookers have been in Massachusetts for hundreds of years. Most of the,
Well, that isn't a question there.
most of the towns in the Connecticut River Valley were built by hookers. And my wife, who grew up in Hadley, which is in the Connecticut River Valley, the name of her elementary school was the Hooker School. And when she went to college, she was kind of embarrassed. People said, "Where'd you go to school?" She said, "I went to the Hooker School." I said, "Ah." But why is that? Because Joe Hooker, they call him Fighting Joe, because when he was at second in command, he would always get right into it and fight. When he was the top guy, he got nervous about losing, so he couldn't fight as well. But the general before him had been Pope, the bishop, and Pope, as you may be aware, there are women of ill repute who follow armies around. Still do, yeah. Camp followers. Some of them did laundry, and that's kind of the excuse that people say, "Oh, they're just doing the laundry." But General Pope was very offended by having these women around, so he banned them from being anywhere near the camp. So no more prostitutes near my camp. Get them away. Well, Joe Hooker came along, and he said, "You know what? They're guys. It's really mean to keep them away from the hookers or from the prostitutes." But he said, "Okay, we'll let them come into camp." Reporters went nuts over that and began to call the prostitutes hookers' girls, which is where the term hooker comes from. So, unfortunately, I remember bringing a field trip into Boston, and there's a statue of Joe Hooker in front of the State House. And it says Hooker on the base of the statue. And the kids are saying, "Why is there a statue of hookers in front of the State Capitol?" I said, "No, it's Joe Hooker." I guess indirectly it is. Yes.
Were the soldiers volunteers?
At the beginning they were, but because they thought the war was going to last for about 3 or 4 months. And most people, when they signed up for 4 to 6 months, which was a big issue when the war lasted for more than 6 months. And so then they came up with the draft. And the draft was kind of imperfect, as it has always been. And in the Civil War, you could, for $200, you could buy your way out of being drafted.
Yeah.
So the rich kids didn't go, as often is the case. So they had to come up with a draft. They always had volunteers, but as the war got nastier and nastier, the volunteers numbers began to go down. There were some guys who went in and just thought that it was the right thing to do, and they did it. But there were other people who thought, nah. When you see, you go to a battle and you see lines of, there's one photograph, I don't know if I've got it here. There's one photograph of one of the battlefields. Yeah, this one here. It's like they're all in a row, and people look at it and they say, what did they do? They move the bodies? No. They died in rows. And so you're a soldier, a guy who grew up in Haverhill. You had a choice between working in a shoe factory or going to fight in the war. Well, I'm going to go fight in the war because that's glorious. Read all the poems. And then they get there and whoa. And if they survive, they come home without a leg or an arm. And their buddies say, "I don't think this is such a good idea." And so it became harder and harder as the war progressed. But the thing is, the guys who survived were tough son of a guns. It's an interesting thing. One of the biggest fears in Europe after the Civil War, we had almost 1 million veterans of the Civil War. Almost 1 million. And one of the biggest fears was that we would start beating the crap out of everybody, because we had 1 million of the best fighters in the world, in our country. And they thought, all through history, when everybody has that many soldiers, they use them. But the United States said, "Okay, we're done." They sent them home. So, it was, but there are a lot of Europeans who were very scared that we were going to do something with that million veterans. And so those guys were tough. I mean, they'd been through really bad times for 4 years. Most of the Americans who died in the Civil War died of disease, either from being wounded or because they were in camp, because camps were nasty places. Most of the young men who went to the Civil War didn't know what they were doing. A good example, and here's some trivia for you, you can tell at the dinner table sometime. before the Civil War, the average American did not know his right foot from his left foot. Because there was no need to know the difference. First, because all the shoes were the same. When you bought a pair of shoes, they were both exactly the same. And when you wore them, the leather was soft enough that it would conform to the shape of your foot. And eventually you'd have a left foot and a left foot shoe. But you didn't need to know the difference when you bought your shoes. The average town had one street in it. So if you're giving somebody directions, you didn't have to say, take a left down at the corner. There was no left at the corner. So most people didn't know their left and the right, which turned out to be a really big issue for sergeants, for drill sergeants. Classic drill sergeant, left, 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 right, left, right. How are you going to do that with, most of you guys don't know their left and their right. So what they did was, a lot of the guys, especially at the beginning, were farm kids who knew the difference between straw and hay. So you took straw to their left foot and hay to their right foot. And you'd say, straw, 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 hay, straw, hay, straw, hay. And that's how they were able to get through with learning. Eventually they learned their left and their right. But before the Civil War, there was no need to know it. There was no need to know your left from your right. So they didn't know it.
Should have said he and horn.
Well, the mules and things, yeah. Some sergeants did that too. But they figured straw and hay, they could do that. So that was working, because they could look down at their feet and see their straw, they would be able to do that. All kinds of things, terms come from the Civil War, I think are kind of interesting. The whole shebang. Now, shebang was was like a portable pub that the Irish troops brought onto the battlefield with them. And when a soldier was made, when he was given his equipment, he was given half a tent. So the idea was he was being forced to pair up with somebody. And they put the two halves together to make a whole tent. And so they began to call that, because it looked kind of like the little portable pubs the Irish brought with them, they called them the whole shebang. Instead of half a shebang, it was a whole shebang. Mind your beeswax. You know that one, right? That came from the Civil War. Because cosmetics were in very short supply during the Civil War, especially in the South. And so what Southern women would do is they would use beeswax instead of makeup when they went out for it. But if they stood too close to a fireplace or in the sun, it would start to melt. And a nice polite woman would say, mind your beeswax. It's starting to melt. Some of the others, just to kind of finish up, blockhead. Blockhead was what they used to put hats on in stores. So they said you have as much brains as a blockhead, you blockhead. Bread basket is a term that came out in the Civil War. Place where you put your bread. Chief cook and bottle washer. Lots of times they didn't have professional chefs, so you'd get the guy who did the dishes would also be the cook. The chief cook and bottle washer. Fit to be tied. Galoot. Galoot was a term used by sailors, what they would call Marines. If you're a sailor or Marine, you know sailors, Marines are kind of oil and water. So it was a term that sailors used to call the Marines galoots. What's the scuttlebutt? The scuttlebutt was the water bucket on a ship in the Navy. And so the sailors would gather to get water, and they would kind of do gossip while they were there. One of my favorites is shoddy, because there were some factories in the north that made their uniforms out of scraps, and the scraps were called shods. So the uniform was made out of scraps instead of real whole cloth. It was called a shoddy uniform, made out of scraps instead. Son of a gun. This is one kind of finish son of a gun. Sailors sometimes, because they didn't have Joe Hooker as their commander, would sneak prostitutes on board their ships. And the best place to meet the prostitute was by the cannons. And if the prostitute got pregnant, the child was the son of a gun. So, our time about...
Yes, sir.
Does anybody have any questions?
How much that rifle weigh?
35 pounds, maybe? You're welcome to come up and pick it up if you want.
I tried lifting one in.
Yeah, we're a different kind of people. They were used to lifting stuff like this all the time. I think that's a big part of it. Yes.
I just want to comment, our National Park Service has done a great job on a lot of these Civil War battle locations, like Gettysburg, Antietam,
Yeah,
Petersburg, so.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
in the area, they
Oh,
won't
yeah.
look at that.
You know what's my favorite place is Harper's Ferry.
I bet
You ever go to Harper's Ferry?
Right.
It's an awesome place. It's unbelievable. And you realize, a lot of people don't realize, Harper's Ferry, the largest number of POWs ever taken in one time was at Harper's Ferry. 30,000 Union troops were captured at Harper's Ferry.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome to look at the stuff over here. Thank you very much, guys. Look at anything here if you want before you go.